Have you ever been given a wide open opportunity to share your gifts, but you found yourself shrinking back? You were held back by something inside you. I remember not too long ago when a church had invited me to come and perform songs from my latest album, well, my only album, at their picnic. At first, I was excited, but as I thought about it and thought about actually stepping into that, I hesitated big time. When they approached me, I remember telling myself, well, I'm not a rapper. I'm just someone who can rap sometimes. And right there, before even stepping into that, I bowed out. Today, I want to dive into the stories that we tell ourselves, the ones that limit our sense of who we are and what we're capable of. These stories put up walls between us ultimately and our creative calling. So let's talk about recognizing them, reframing them, and breaking through them. Because you guys, this journey toward freeing our creativity isn't just about skills. It's not just about equipping ourselves for stuff, right? It's really about the stories that we believe. So as we continue on in our month's journey in storytelling, we're going to get into that and more on this episode of the Ordered Chaos Club podcast. Welcome back to the Ordered Chaos Club podcast, where we explore the intersection of faith, creativity, and the journey toward a purposeful life. We bring together Christian creatives who are looking to overcome challenges in their faith or in their creative work and to embrace creativity with confidence and use their God-given talents, all so that we can experience breakthroughs, right? Progress, significant progress towards our boldest creative goals this year. So today we're going to be diving into something that shapes every one of us, every aspect of our journey. It's those inner narratives that hold us back or that can push us forward. This idea of limiting narratives, you guys, is deeply personal to me. It's been a theme in my life, and I know I can't be alone in this. I recently heard about a concept from another podcast that I enjoy. This concept was called self-checking, and it's something that you see in basketball. Oh, by the way, this podcast is called the Mind Shift Podcast with Erwin McManus and his son Aaron. But the idea of self-checking, it is where there's a player who's open, right? They're wide open, but they don't take the shot because they lack confidence. And eventually, even the opponents, they know it, so they stop guarding them because they know they won't shoot. And I remember that day when they were offering me this invite for this picnic, I self-checked. I let a limiting narrative stop me from taking a shot of something that I actually enjoyed. And you know what's wild? David faced Goliath with just 5 smooth stones and a sling. Imagine if he had told himself, well, I'm just a shepherd boy. The story would have ended very differently, right? But David knew something that we often forget. Our identity isn't in our job title or our credentials, but it's in whose we are, who we belong to. So let's break down this idea of limiting ourselves with the stories that we tell down into 4 different steps. Understanding these narratives, recognizing them in ourselves, reframing them, and finally, breaking through them. So first, what exactly are limiting narratives? In his book, The Artisan Soul, Erwin Raphael McManus talks about the difference between our experienced self and our remembered self. You might actually recall that I did a blog that dealt with this on the Ordered Chaos Club blog. And it's not the events themselves that define us, right? But the meaning that we attach to them. These are all narratives that we build, and they form the core of who we believe ourselves to be. You guys know what fascinates me? In Genesis 32, Jacob, he wrestles with God and he gets renamed, right? His old name is gone. He gets a new name, Israel. The old narrative of being the deceiver, the supplanter, right? He takes his brother's place, right? That's gone. God literally rewrote that. But here's the thing. Jacob had to participate in that. He had to wrestle all night long. Think about Moses at the burning bush. His immediate response was, God, who am I to go to Pharaoh? Like, that's a limiting narrative, if I've ever heard one, you guys. But God's response wasn't to list Moses' qualifications and his history and his experiences. Instead, God simply said, I'll be with you. Sometimes our limiting narratives aren't just about us. They're about forgetting who our God is and who God is in our story. So let me give you 3 common limiting narratives I see, especially in different creatives. And if you're somebody in the community, I would love it if we would talk about this in our next weekly club meeting. So here's a few. 1, I'm not qualified enough. That's like looking at your credentials and feeling like they don't stack up. 2, someone else already did it better, right? You're comparing. It's the comparison narrative. Or maybe I'm not ready yet. The perfectionist narrative. Is there a place where you ever will be ready? Each of these narratives has a common thread. They focus on our perceived inadequacies rather than God's adequacy, right? So let's look at how we can now recognize limiting narratives in ourselves. Recognizing these is the next step. First, we've understood some of them, but let's see where they are in us. And it requires some vulnerability and some real honesty. For me, that narrative of I'm not a real rapper, I'm just someone who raps sometimes, right? That kept me from fully embracing my passion for music in some respects. It's become, you guys, a lens even that colors every opportunity, every choice that I make. Let me share something, mildly vulnerable with you guys. By now, if you've been rocking with the pod, you know I get vulnerable a bit. Earlier this year, I felt the urge to work on a second album, right? That old narrative around me being a rapper, however, it crept in and started convincing me to leave that to the real rappers. I can just, do some stuff behind the scenes or whatever. But even with starting the OCC, the club altogether, an imposter syndrome narrative started whispering, who are you to teach others about creativity? A lot like that thing that Moses was saying, right? But this time, I caught it. I recognized it for what it was, and it was just simply fear dressed up as humility. Well, here are some warning signs that you might be operating under a limiting narrative. You frequently use phrases like, I'm just, or I'm not really, Yeah, you might be using a limiting narrative. You compare your beginning to someone else's middle, or even worse, to their highlight reel. Like as I got started with this podcast, if I'm comparing myself to someone who's been doing this sort of thing for years later and feeling like I don't measure up, that's a limiting narrative. You find yourself making excuses for why you can't take opportunities. You downplay your achievements or your gifts. I do that a lot. You're waiting for some external validation before you'll claim your identity as an artist. At one point in my life, and sometimes even currently, I find myself victim to one or more of these stories. And I would echo them over and over again in my head. And I don't know about you. I'm tired of being a victim to my own brutality to myself. You guys, the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 10:5 about taking every thought captive. That's what we're doing when we recognize these narratives. We're catching them before they can really try and direct our lives, direct our paths. So now let's look at reframing them, right? So once we recognize this destructive storytelling, the challenge is to now reframe the narrative, retell the story. This is where we take the pen back and we begin rewriting our own story in light of truth. So let me walk you through a reframing process here that we should be going through. So we recognize the old narrative. I'm not a real rapper. So let's question that narrative, right? Let's not just accept it. Let's question it. Well, what makes someone a real rapper? And then let's ask a question about the truth there. Is this standard from God, or from my own fears? And then let's go to the truth. In Ephesians 2:10, God says, for we are his handiwork, God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, right? So my new narrative based in light of that truth is I'm an artist created by God with a unique voice and a message. That doesn't ignore maybe some insecurities around rapping, but it recognizes I'm an artist. Here's another powerful reframe that I think somebody maybe who's a painter could use. An old narrative might be, my art isn't good enough to share. This could be for any creative. Questioning it, well, what defines good enough? And what sets this standard, right? So here's the truth check. Is this standard from God or from my perfectionism and fear? So let's look at the truth. Scripture says in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. So the standard, right? Here it is, the new narrative. My art is an act of worship, and God delights in my faithful creation. So the standard now becomes about the worship and not simply the outcome. Remember what Paul said about his own limitations. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, he says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Sometimes our limiting narratives are the very places where God's strength can shine through most clearly. So let's look at how to break through. How do we break through these limiting narratives? Now, here's where it becomes a daily act of courage. It's not like a switch you flip and you're good. You got to break through more than just the one time. It's a repeated intentional choice to believe and act differently. We have to reshape what we believe and rewire how we respond. So let me share some practical steps that have helped me and some others break through barriers that these destructive stories can create. So one could be the small steps approach. So maybe start with some low stakes situations. Like in regards to my music, maybe not like just releasing a whole album, but dropping a single, sharing it with sharing that song, with a trusted friend. Build confidence through small wins, developing your confidence as you go and making sure you're documenting your progress, because you're going to need to remind yourself of what's happening here, of the truth you're building. What about the community challenge? Find people who will call out your gifts. That's part of the value of the Ordered Chaos Club. You've got a community that will lift you up and that will point out your limiting narratives and will remind you of the truths. Let others speak truth into your story, and you can celebrate others' breakthroughs, right? What about the faith integration? Making sure that you're bringing it back to your faith. You can begin each and every creative session with a prayer, really offering that up to the Lord. And then keep a journal of God's faithfulness in your creative journey, just like many do with prayer journals where they write down their prayer request and his response. Do the same with your creative work. And then make sure you create from a place of worship rather than performance. Remember whose opinion truly matters. All right. And related to this, a friend recommended keeping, I haven't tried this, but they recommended keeping what they called a truth journal. Every time someone gives you feedback that contradicts your limiting narrative, you write that down because you need to create a new narrative. Every time we see God use our creativity in ways we didn't expect, we record it. It can become our own personal book of remembrance, like the stones of remembrance in Joshua 4. And lastly, and kind of relatedly, to break through the limiting narratives we've carried, it's essential to recognize that these thoughts, they operate in our mind. These stories, they operate a lot like soundtracks, persistent, repeating loops that play in the background of our minds, shaping how we view ourselves and ultimately what we believe that we're truly capable of. Author John Acuff, who wrote a book called Soundtracks, describes in there how by default, many of these soundtracks are negative. They hold us back or even prevent us from showing up fully in our creative callings. But here's the powerful truth. Just like any soundtrack that we've got the ability to retire these old limiting thoughts. We don't have to keep putting them on the record player. We can put those away and we can replace them with new ones rooted in truth and possibility, and repeat those positive soundtracks enough until they become our new default. It's taken us years to write and record and release these old soundtracks. It's going to take work to replace them. But when we intentionally rewrite these inner scripts, we aren't just encouraging ourselves. We're reshaping our creative lives, exchanging self-doubt for boldness, and seeing our God-given potential with clarity. I encourage you, get in front of yourself in the mirror daily, maybe in the morning and before bedtime, and rewrite the script, retell the new narrative, the new soundtrack that you want embedded in you. Remember, the stories that we tell ourselves, they're not set in stone. These are as changeable as a playlist. And with the right soundtracks, we can start creating a life that reflects our true identity and calling. Let me tell you what happened when I finally pushed past some of my limiting narratives, specifically the one about leading in this creative space. Last week, an OCC member shared with me how they lead an after-school club at a Christian school that they work at, and that she has been using my creativity journal that I shared for free on my blog to help structure some of her gatherings. That was powerful to me. That's what happens when we break through our limiting narratives. We don't just empower ourselves, we empower others as well. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you guys found inspiration and some insight in this conversation about faith, creativity, and the power of storytelling. Now, if this episode resonated with you, go ahead and take a minute to subscribe to the podcast. If you're on YouTube, you know where to do that. Make sure you like the video, but if you're watching this or listening on Spotify, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes as we continue to dive deeper into Christ-centered creativity. Hey, and if you're enjoying the content we're creating here, I'd love for you to go ahead and rate and review the show as well so others can find it. It really helps, the algorithms catch other people and helps folks that are searching for conversations like this that matter to Christian creatives. And if you know someone who would be encouraged by today's episode, go ahead and share it with them. Keep spreading this truth, this impact, so that more folks can be released to go after God's calling on their lives. And I want to personally invite you to join our creative community, the Ordered Chaos Club. There's something truly special that is happening here amongst us. It's a place for Christian creatives to find support, accountability, and inspiration on their creative journey. But here's the thing, the founders cohort won't be open for long. Right now, if you jump in, there's a 30% discount, bringing it down to $17.50 a month or $175 for the year. And it's going to only be open for a limited time up until we get about, we got a little bit less than 20 people that we can still allow in. So this is your chance to jump in early, connect deeply, and really get going with like-minded creatives as we shape the future of this community together. So don't miss out. To join, you just go ahead and go to orderedchaosclub.com and check out the application link that's right there in the header and sign up before the founders cohort closes. Thanks again for being a part of this journey. Can't wait to see the amazing things that you create and you share with the world. Until next time, be blessed, be a blessing, and keep creating for God's glory.